All right, so here we are. Let's go ahead and get started. Thank you everyone for joining us today. And if you forgot what you signed up for, what Zoom is this? This is the OWCN lecture series number 3. This is the overview and lessons learned from pipeline P00547. We've got a great lineup of folks today. They're going to talk about kind of an overview of this incident and some of the lessons learned that we took away from it. So again, just as a reminder, this is part of the OWCN winter lecture series taking place this year between January and June. And this is our 3rd of 6 lectures. So you can kind of see what we've already covered and what's coming up. And just another reminder too, that we are recording these webinars and posting them online for OWCN responders. You can access this through your responder profile. And if you have any issues finding out where these are, please just email us at owcn@ucdavis.edu. We have to help you find it. All right, so today though, we're focusing on the overview and lessons learned from the pipeline incident. Our agenda today is going to include just a brief intro by me, and I'll be kind of your host today. And then we're going to move into some great content and presentations. We're going to start with the Wildlife Branch Initial Response Overview by Greg McGowan, the CDFW OSPR, who served as the initial Wildlife Branch Director. We're going to move into recovery operations with Kira Mills, who served as the initial Recovery Group Supervisor, followed by Field Stabilization Operations by Dr. Dwayne Tom, who served as the initial Field Stabilization Group Supervisor. Then Care and Processing with Deneen Bertel, our initial Care and Processing Group Supervisor. So you get the theme here, a lot of group supervisors and Wildlife Branch Directors. Then we'll go back to Greg to kind of summarize some of our lessons learned and then finish up with some Q&A, which is going to be hosted by Dr. Mike Sicardi, who served as our Deputy Wildlife Branch Director during most of this incident. So without further ado, let me just quickly go through some Zoom reminders and then we'll get started with the content. So just a reminder, this is a webinar today, it's not a meeting. So what that means is that for audio settings is that you are not going to be able to unmute yourselves. So if you do have questions, you can use the chat to kind of talk to one another, say hi, but we'd ask that you please use the Q&A feature. So chat for highs and hellos, but then the Q&A feature for all your questions. And we'll be using that to be able to track you guys' great questions, which I'm sure you'll have. And again, Mike's going to help us kind of lead that endeavor towards the end of the hour here to make sure we can answer some of those questions before we wrap up. And again, if you need to leave for any reason, feel free to just hit the leave meeting button, and that's how you exit. So I think that is all the basics you need. And so I want to go ahead and stop sharing and have Deneen share her screen.
Okay, I'm going to share real quick, and Scott just give me the thumbs up that you are seeing the correct screen. Awesome. All right, I'm going to mute myself and turn it over to Greg to get us started.
Thanks, Deneen. Thanks, Scott. Hey, everybody. Good afternoon. Glad everybody could join us. Looks like there's about 75 people here, which is terrific. So I'm going to go over just a brief introduction to the spill overall, and then the vast majority of today I'll be talking about the good stuff, the content about the wildlife operations associated with the response. So on this map, you can see up at the top is Long Beach, the bottom is San Diego. It's about 100 miles. That striped area there is a fisheries closure area. The pipeline break is up at the top from a platform. There's a pipeline that goes onshore to a processing facility. And that pipeline was damaged and leaked. So you can see covered a pretty significant distance there, about 100 miles of coastline. We got through from October 2nd. The last sign up of the shoreline being clean was December 27th, right after Christmas. Next slide. It was a pretty significant sized response. We had 18 vessels on water recovering oil, 13 of the area contingency plan sites were protected, and those protections require maintenance and that sort of thing. As many as 1,800 people working the beaches, the shorelines, the water, care and processing, all those sorts of things. Next slide. Just a quick overview of a lot of the key players here. It was significant interest in the spill and significant response from everybody, local, state, federal, private, public, etc. Next slide. Volunteers were a key element today. Of course, we're going to talk about including a lot of the work of the OWCN volunteer members, but there was also lots. We opened up a volunteer hotline. We got 10,000 people that registered in a day or two. had to deal with some HAZWOPER challenges and that sort of thing, but volunteers remain a critical component of large-scale spill response in California. Next slide. So in the end, we recovered about 9,000 gallons of the 25,000 gallons that were released from on water, from on the land. The wildlife recovery number is unverified. There was a number, it was 49 gallons, but that seemed like a high amount of oil to get from the number of animals we had. So I'm not sure that number was, that might have included some water or some oil from separately, but about 9,000 gallons in total. Next slide. So a couple slides here just on the first day or so for me as wildlife branch director and deputy wildlife branch director and a few others. So on Saturday morning, I got a heads up that from our law enforcement chief Hamilton that there were some unconfirmed reports of a significant event. So I shot out a couple texts to the OSPR wildlife team, Laird Henkel, Corey, and Holly Gellerman, and also to OWCN, and let those guys know there was possibly something. I also got a call from my boss. I got a call from a couple other people. So there was kind of a flurry of activity and then radio silence. And in my experience of having done spill response for coming up on 30 years, that high flurry of activity followed by silence either means it's a non-issue and what isn't an issue, or it's a big issue and everybody's got their head down and working. So I started looking at travel options, canceled my Saturday plans, weekend plans. By Saturday afternoon, a large scale response was initiated. We activated OWCN for deployment. For me, my first thing is not to go charging out of the room or run to an airport or what have you, but to get familiar with the location. Where am I going? What are the resources at risk? What's the shoreline habitat? Where are wildlife going to be? What do we know about that area? On that resources at risk, just to note that there is going to be an OWCN workshop on June 6th about species prioritization index and resources at risk. So if you want to kind of hear about that process, join us on June 6th. I talked with our group again, Holly, Corey, Laird, and Dr. Zaccardi about staffing and how we're going to get going. Next slide. So we all jumped on an airplane. A bunch of us got on an airplane, I think 7 a.m. on Sunday morning, got down to San Diego, or I guess Long Beach, wherever it was we flew into, Long Beach, I think, and split up at the airport. Some of us going to the command post, some recovery, field stabilization, and care. First thing at the ICP, that was the MSRC, which is an oil spill response organization. It was their office right near the airport, and it was already jam-packed with people. There was nowhere to sit. They suggested us back to, I think, a conference room or an office room, but it was packed, and there was like one seat in there, and this is still during COVID, of course. So we spread out. I looked in the kitchen, found that if I moved a few garbage cans and a recycling can, Dr. Zaccardi and I could get a place to sit. So we sat down by the sink and got to work. And that first plan is just get organized. We need a safety plan, staffing plans. We need our procedures, protocols, documentation. We need to talk to lots of people. What's going on? What's happening? Who's going where? What's the plan on that sort of thing? A group of people came in by airplane, VIPs, and wanted to know what was going on and talk to all the group leads and all that. Lots and lots of questions. What's happening? Are you on this? Are you dealing with this? As the wildlife branch director, my boss is the operations section chief. Check in with them. Hey, we're doing this. We've got this. We have people on the ground. Here's how it's going to stand up. We'll get documentation to you shortly. Unified command, same. The environmental unit, who's of course our super close partner in dealing with wildlife issues. What are they up to? What's going on? So that we're synced up, and then start planning for work tomorrow. Just as I say, get organized. You can see kind of the first operations section org chart there on the left, made in a couple of hours, and then the one the next day on the right. Next slide. I'm going to talk a little bit about Reconnaissance before turning it over to the rest of the wildlife group, and then I'll check back in at the end. The Reconnaissance group, the group supervisor was Holly Gellerman. So first task there to organize the hotline, that is the OWCN hotline is used, but we transfer that over to an operator at OSPR for the going in the response. We need to get planes up in the sky or a plane, get aerial overflights and mapping. You can see one of the maps there on the right. Coordinate on-water reconnaissance, coordinate land-based reconnaissance, and coordinate with the recovery group to ensure appropriate coverage. As I think probably most of you are familiar with, the reconnaissance group is largely working outside the hot zone for an animal that might have gotten oiled and then flew to a pond or a lake or a harbor or somewhere else to preen and clean and deal with that. So while the recovery group is working the hot zone, the recon group is working the periphery. But to a certain extent, the reconnaissance group is working wherever the recovery group isn't and where we might have oiled wildlife. So they have to be closely aligned and paired up to make sure that we're getting the best coverage to capture as many impacted animals as we possibly can. A few takeaways from that. Really, what I thought was really successful one night there to the beginning is to use local resources, particularly when you're looking at the habits of a wide array of animals, to know that, in a storm, grebes fly back to this backwater area or this other area to take refuge. Knowing that is incredibly helpful compared to even someone experienced California biologist still doesn't know necessarily the ins and outs of little habitat areas within Huntington Beach and that sort of thing. So that was really helpful to kind of where are the key inland refugia areas and kind of what are the wildlife we're looking for likely to be doing right now. As I mentioned, coordinating effectively with the recovery staff. Hey, where are you guys going? Do you need help? Where could we be? How do we want to work this together? What are you able to do effectively? What should we do to make sure you can be most efficient and that sort of thing. One issue, and this may come up a few times, at the end of the week, the first, I forget, 7th or 8th day or something like that, it really seemed like there wasn't much oil on the water. There wasn't much oil on the beach. It really seemed to be spinning downward very quickly. Initially, we were called out because the response was 125,000 gallons. They knew that number had been overestimated. So kind of looking like things were winding down. That was before the tar balls wound up and started really moving into the whole 100 miles of affected area. So probably could have stayed out there a little bit longer with the recon group. There was an area, a National Wildlife Refuge, which is overlaid by military operations, and that prevented some surveys. That was a challenge. And there's always land use challenges when trying to deal with the spill, but that was one that came up on this one. And then on recon, I think we talked about it was useful. That first 48 hours, there's a lot to be done that doesn't have to be sitting in the incident command post. And it was probably most efficient to, sorry about that, to actually, to get out and work, or to work from home for that first 48 hours or from the office before deploying. You do need to deploy, but that was useful to work from home. And with that, I will pass it on to talk about recovery. I think. Yes.
Thanks, Greg. Good morning, or I guess good afternoon, everyone. My name is Kara Mills. I'm the Senior Manager of Field Operations for the OWCN during non-spill times. And as Scott mentioned, I served as Recovery Group Supervisor during certain portions of this spill. Next slide. So just to give a brief overview of our mobilization, Greg talked a little bit about how sort of the chain of events of how things played out. But we were notified on October 2nd at about 11 o'clock. We were notified by OSPR. This didn't mean initial activation. So the activation actually came later. We were officially activated about 6:35 that evening. But in the meantime, because we knew that this could potentially be a major event, we met as a management team in what we call the planning. We have this planning meeting where we go through basically a set of questions talking about what we know about the spill, the product, the extent, any of the species that are affected, and we come up with a really solid plan for if we do get activated. So we did use that time pretty wisely, and we had a plan by about 2:45. And so October 3rd, like Greg mentioned, we had the first teams that some of them flew down on the first flight. In the meantime, we had several teams that were pulling trailers, UTVs that we used. And so basically all the gear left Davis at about 5 o'clock in the morning, 4:30, 5 a.m. At 9 o'clock in the morning, we had our first recovery teams that arrived on site. And the first bird was recovered at about 9:30 in the morning. It was a ruddy duck. You can actually see it here. And Deneen is going to show you the clean version of the same bird. Next slide. So to talk a little bit about the networks that were the network facilities that were either activated or on standby. So our primary care facility for birds was the Los Angeles Oilbird Care and Education Center, located in San Pedro and also the home of IBR South. We had activated the Wetlands and Wildlife Care Center in Huntington Beach, and that facility served as a field staging area as well as a field stabilization center. There was minimal marine mammal response, but on standby, we had several facilities, including the Marine Mammal Care Center, Los Angeles, also located in San Pedro. We also had Pacific Marine Mammal Center in Laguna Beach. And finally, we had SeaWorld San Diego in San Diego. Next slide. So the area of impact of this spill stretched from Seal Beach south to San Diego County. It initially started just off Huntington Beach, but as Greg mentioned, as time went on, we started finding more and more tar balls that were sort of spreading south. So a lot of the product spread south. So I'll talk a little bit about this later, but anyway, so within that area, we had snowy plover habitat. So this is the western snowy plover, which is a threatened species. And in this case, it was really fortunate because we did have a lot of local biologists that we were able to pair up with pretty quickly because they had a lot of great information on the snowy plovers that were in this area. So we got reports of oiled plovers and we eventually captured 7 of them. These were stabilized at Wetlands and Wildlife Care Center and then transferred over to the primary care center in San Pedro. Within this area, there was also sensitive habitats, which included Seal Beach National Wildlife Refuge, Bolsa Chica Ecological Reserve, Talbert Regional Park, as well as a few others. Greg talked a little bit about reconnaissance. We did have people in reconnaissance, the reconnaissance group, that were keeping eyes out for any impacted birds that were showing up at these areas. And we were sending some of the recovery teams to scout these areas and see if there were any oiled birds. Next slide. So as mentioned, Wetlands and Wildlife Care Center was used as our primary field staging area, as well as the facility that was activated for field stabilization prior to being transported to the primary care facility, which was within about 2 hours from Huntington Beach. So being co-located with field stabilization, having recovery and field stabilization next to each other was really beneficial. Because Dwayne, Dr. Tom and his team, they were there to stabilize the birds that were coming in. So it was really, really convenient. In addition to that, we had a very large parking lot so we could park. You can see in this picture, we had trailers, we had boats, we had UTVs. So it was really great. It also had a lock gate that we could lock it at night. During the day, we had a guard on duty. So they could control people that were coming in, and which was really beneficial since there was a huge media presence, especially at the beginning of the spill. It was also a very central location. As I said initially, the birds that we were finding were pretty much right off Huntington Beach. But then, you know, it was a central location initially. Like I said, it moved further south, and I'll talk about that challenge, I think, in the next slide. And it provided easy access to the beach. Next slide. So yeah, one of our biggest challenges was that it was a very long stretch of coastline. It went from Seal Beach down to San Diego, which is about 100 miles. And so we were finding that as time went on, we were having to send our recovery teams further south, which meant a lot of driving time for these teams. So not ideal, but it was what we were working with at the time. As the spill was winding down and most of the animals were being found further south, we were sending local teams out. So it was a little bit less driving time. Next slide. In terms of personnel, we had a very quick and positive response when we sent out a request for recovery staff and volunteers. Overall, we used 50 responders in staff roles and 10 in volunteer roles, belonging to 13 member organizations from the network and 2 affiliated organizations. In the past, we've really relied pretty heavily on using responders and staff roles, but for this response, we're able to complement the need for more personnel in the field with people that were able to fill volunteer roles that were HAZWOPER trained. In addition, we had a couple people from OSPR, Mike Harris and Colleen Young, that were there starting day 2. They brought boats and their 4x4 vehicles, which we used quite a bit. So they were really, really helpful to have. Next slide. For transport of animals from field stabilization to the primary care facility, we relied on the OSPR volunteer coordinator who helped line up natural resource volunteers. So we basically had 2 natural resource volunteers staged at field stabilization every single day, ready to do transport. It was really terrific to have that level of response from the NRVs. One downside is that, well, it was sort of a plus because we weren't finding quite as many animals as we predicted we were going to find, which was terrific. And so what we did was that we decided to do 2 transports a day. And so that meant a lot of sitting time for the NRV volunteers, which wasn't great, but they were helping out with a few other things at the staging area. Next slide. So in terms of equipment and supplies, because we did have our first teams that flew down that early the next morning on October 3rd, they weren't able to bring a lot of supplies with them. The good news is that we did have an initial cache of supplies, field supplies at Wetlands and Wildlife. In addition to that, we have a field ops trailer that is located nearby in Irvine. So we are able to bring that trailer over and supply, have some more supplies on hand. Because our other teams left Davis in the morning on October 3rd, they weren't there until the afternoon. So we needed to be able to have our recovery teams have these field supplies before that. So it worked out. I'll talk about some of the lessons learned on my last slide. So like I said, Mike Harris and Colleen Young from OSPR brought additional supplies. They had 2 boats and they also had 4x4 trucks. We brought UTVs, utility terrain vehicles, from Davis, and they were extremely helpful because we did have those long stretches of beaches to comb. In addition to just the regular field equipment that we had, such as just, the typical dip nets, we also had some specialized gear, including net guns and snare mats. Next slide. So even though we've been reporting on the Wildlife Recovery app for several years now, it has only been used a handful of times during spills, and each time it is used, it provides a great opportunity for putting this app to the test and fine-tuning it to make it even better. For many of our responders that helped during this spill, it was really the first time that they had used it. So it provided great practice and familiarization during the spill. The downside is that it's still not quite as user-friendly and intuitive as we would like. It does require some instruction initially to be able to use it correctly. And I said just some of that practice. It doesn't, you really need to practice a little bit to become familiar with it. Because we don't have a large number of medium to large spills, which is a good thing, the only practice that our responders really get is during trainings or drills. So it makes it a little bit challenging in order to use this app during spills. And I'll talk a little bit about this during the lessons learned part. Next slide. Okay, so getting to lessons learned. As with every spill, there were many lessons learned and things that we can do better and improve on. But a few things that really stood out. Early activation, it's always key in any response. It's very, very important. Getting folks in the field, on the ground as soon as possible is always preferred rather than getting reports from, for example, members of the public before we have people on the ground. Especially in this area, there's a lot of people that are on beaches, huge population. And so we knew we were going to be getting a lot of reports from the public. From a PR perspective, as spills can be very emotionally charged for the public. So we learned this from Refugio, and this was certainly the case for this spill as well. Easy and quick access to supplies and equipment. So we did have, like I said, we did have some supplies and equipment that were ready and available when our first teams made it there. Because it was not a lot of equipment, if we would have had to activate even more teams initially, we would have been stretched pretty thin. And so we are in discussion to be able to put an additional trailer, maybe at Wetlands and Wildlife, for even better storage of a greater number of supplies and equipment on site. Making the wildlife recovery app more intuitive and providing practice opportunities. This is always a challenge, as I mentioned before, but we are planning on incorporating even more opportunities for our responders to be able to practice prior to spills. Also, as a result of feedback that we got from responders that used the wildlife recovery app during the spill, we are including a new round of edits to the app to make it easier to use and more intuitive. And finally, even though we do have a large number of responders in our database, I think we're up to about 1,600, and even quite a few of those in the Southern California region, only a fraction of them were current with their HAZWOPER training and some of the other trainings that we would prefer people to have prior to responding to a spill in the recovery group. So we are really, really hoping to beef up those numbers in the coming years. So if you are interested in becoming more trained up on the recovery side of things, keep an ear out for trainings, the basic responder training and the oiled wildlife specialist training. We will be providing more training. So please, if you are interested, we can use you. So that's all I have. Thank you.
Thanks, Kira. Hi, everyone. I'm Dwayne Tom. I'm the field veterinarian at OWCN, and my role in the ICS role in this response was as the field stabilization group supervisor. Next slide. When we got the activation word, Wetlands and Wildlife Care Center was determined to be the site for field stabilization. It's almost an 8-hour drive down there without any traffic. So instead we flew down. This allowed us to get there fresh and ready to go. We arrived early in the morning, and the staff at Wetlands and Wildlife met us there to get a head start on setting things up before the animals started being recovered. Next slide. So being able to use Wetlands and Wildlife for field stabilization was a great advantage. We had a secure facility with lots of room to work and an OWCN inventory of supplies. And as Kira mentioned, it was also efficient being at the same site as the recovery staging area, both for the transport of animals and easy communication with each other. And we were still within a reasonable travel distance to the San Pedro facility where primary care was. There are some initial logistical issues getting set up at a facility that we weren't familiar with, but having the Wetlands and Wildlife staff working at field stabilization was very helpful, making adjustments as well as any other facility support we would need. There was also ample number of cages for the patients kept at field stabilization. We had sufficient space that we were able to separate the holding areas for the arriving animals, and then another area for the treatment animals. There was also additional caging area available should the numbers have increased. And being situated across the beach from where we were recovering the small shorebirds, such as the snowy plovers and sanderlings, was especially important in their care to avoid long, stressful transport times. And we also got several animals that had been recovered that ended up being non-oiled, but rather down for other reasons. And they were recovered because they had issues such as fishing line entanglements, fractures, or other injuries that they didn't notice at the time. But being situated at a wildlife rehabilitation facility allowed for a quick and easy transfer of their care. Next slide. At field stabilization, being able to provide prompt stabilization care, we improved our patient survival rates and gave them a head start on their treatments at primary care. The most common conditions that we treated at field stabilization this time around were hypothermia, dehydration, and some of the blocking effects of the oil product that were around their nares, glottis, and obstructing their vents. We were able to begin correcting these conditions early on and then monitor the animals until they are ready to be transferred. Next slide. A decent proportion of the animals that received were these small shorebirds like the plover and the sanderlings. They present additional challenges as their high metabolism requires frequent feeding and hydrating. Doing this by syringe is more time consuming. It can be stressful to the bird, increases the chances of aspiration, and the bird may not be accepting of it, especially after so soon being recovered, captured. So maintaining their hydration was more efficiently done through subcutaneous fluid administration and then getting them transferred to the San Pedro facility as soon as they were stable in order to get them set up in a simulated natural habitat where they would be with other plovers, less stressed, and more likely to self-feed. Next slide, please. Communication using group texts with primary care and other areas worked great. Smooth scheduling transport times, plus any additional transports that we might need for the very small birds that were more urgent. Transport was always available when we had animals ready to go, in addition to delivering needed equipment from our wetlands and wildlife inventories to the San Pedro facility. We did have occasional issues with Google Maps that caused delays when they would take them on a route that was no longer open. And then next slide, please. So for our challenges, almost all of them were encountered early on and soon resolved. These included the media. The first few days was pretty bad with a lot of news media people attempting to get on the property, but security was very helpful. And those that had supposedly been approved were sometimes difficult to determine what they said they had been approved for and what was actually the case. but the wildlife branch was always readily available to clear things up. And having the PIO present during the large media filming was very helpful. We did initially not have disposal drones for oil waste, but they were promptly delivered when requested. The restroom facilities at wetlands could not accommodate both recovery and field stabilization, along with the normal use by the facilities personnel. And so this was quickly addressed with the delivery of porta potties and hand washing stations. And then finally, because local people, they're familiar with wetlands and wildlife, we initially had a few animals that were dropped off and left by the public before we could get the additional collection information needed for a response. Next slide. Some of the lessons learned that we have completed or are in the process of doing so are that because we had flown down, we arrived before the supplies that were coming down in the vehicles. To correct this, we now have a set of field stabilization traveling kits that can support us early on for a response whenever and wherever we might have to fly to. It could also be beneficial having a whiteboard where we could post information such as resolving any animal admission information reminders and questions, also to help with transport and other spill information for the staff. And this has been added to our setup tasks. And then also becoming familiar with how we would set up field stabilization at some of the designated brick and mortar sites could greatly improve our readiness. Next slide. And that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dwayne. All right, so now on to care and processing operations. I'm Deneen Bertel, and I am the readiness coordinator of care operations in non-spill times. And for this incident, as Scott said, I served as the care and processing group supervisor. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the care operations, but I also wanted to do just an overall personnel kind of overview of the statistics, as you know, for us to be able to do the great work that we do, we do need all of you, and it's quite remarkable the effort that was put into this incident. So as was already mentioned, we responded over 45 days. During this time, about 625 hours were worked. And how do we know this? We know this because we processed 650 timesheets, which is, that number just amazes me. We had 93 unique responders across the whole OWCN response, and that included 16 of our 44 member organizations. During this response, we also wanted to really, especially at primary care, we utilized our COVID guidelines and responder agreement that was developed by the Summit work groups. And that included, especially at primary care within the facility, implementing mostly staff level positions to minimize mixing of new individuals. We did use a lot of individuals from International Bird Rescue South and the adjacent member orgs. We did have a small number of volunteers. We basically limited that to IBR South volunteers. And we did implement utilizing the UC Davis Campus Ready daily symptom survey. So each responder would complete this survey. It asks a series of questions, and then they would show the result to their supervisor prior to getting started work for the day. So it would give them like a green, you're good to go, based on what you put into the symptom survey. Additionally, we also encouraged meetings outside, meals outside, and physical distancing with possible, because we were working within a facility. So during this incident, a majority of the primary care operations took place at the Los Angeles Oiled Bird Care and Education Center in San Pedro. This facility is a purpose-built facility that's managed by our partners and network member International Bird Rescue South, as Kira mentioned. We are so very fortunate in California to have such a robust network, including these purpose-built facilities that are ready to respond when we need them. The huge benefit of these facilities is that they are ready to go when we need them, and they are managed by our partners. International Bird Rescue operates their year-round rehabilitation program there while assisting us to keep the facility ready. These facilities have the space and the infrastructure that is needed to support a significant response. While we do the best we can to keep them ready, we always also keep in the back of our minds how we're going to respond when things maybe don't work as we had planned. For example, we had an incident with the wastewater system, but we were able to quickly work through the wildlife branch and get a supplemental system in place very, very quickly. So as much as all the planning we do and all the readiness that we focus on, we always still need to keep in the back of our minds how to troubleshoot things. During the spill, we did have a smaller caseload of live animals. So what we were able to do is to concurrently run the oiled wildlife response and International Bird Rescue's rehabilitation program. We just found an effective and functional way to kind of separate the programs, and it worked really well. We have some lessons learned from that, but I think it worked out well. I wanted to give just an overview, a patient overview within the wildlife branch operations. If you want to see more specifics, such as species breakdowns, etc., please visit our website. We do have a portion of our website dedicated to the incident, and then all the numbers and species breakdowns are there, but I'm going to stick to a brief overview for the sake of time. 141 animals were collected as part of the wildlife branch operations, and this included 116 birds, 7 mammals, 1 reptile, and 17 fish. And of the 141 animals collected, 36 of those were live. And of the 36 live, there was 16 different species that came into primary care. Interestingly, 75% of them were grebes, shorebirds, and gulls. And we released 24 of the 36 live patients, which is about 67%. A little bit about the snowy plovers that Kira and Dwayne talked about, kind of our special patients. As mentioned, they are a state and federally threatened species. And it was definitely a collaborative effort to get these animals captured to field stabilization and to primary care as quickly as possible when they were stable enough to do so. We received a total of 7 snowy plovers. We did set up a special place to house them that was quiet and really kept them away from all of the other operations within the facility. As Dwayne said, they have a high metabolism and they can get stressed. So we wanted to keep them kind of isolated from the rest of the operations and also house them in small groups and give them lots of food items. And they did really well. They self-fed really well. We did order quite a menu for them. The one thing that we did learn is that their skin is somewhat sensitive to the oiling, and I'm not sure if it was the actual product or the length of time that the product was on the animals, or a combination of both. Perhaps, I mean, there could have been some other additional factors, but we did need to treat their skin for some skin burns, and that did increase the time that they were in care with us. But overall, they did really well, and we successfully released all 7 of the snowy plovers that came into care. I also wanted to mention an additional collaboration. We worked within the wildlife branch to arrange the San Diego Zoo Wildlife Alliance plover biologists to come to the facility and federally band them, and also apply their auxiliary color bands, their auxiliary markers. These biologists work with these birds regularly. They have a color system in place. So we wanted to make sure that we were consistent with the system they already had in place. So they came to the facility and we did the pre-release exams, and they banded the birds for us. And it was an excellent collaboration. And hopefully they are able to track these animals for us while they're doing their work. I wanted to talk about O-worms because this is definitely a huge success for us. For those of you who know the Wildlife Rehabilitation Medical Database, or WORMD, we've been working over the past few years to modify this database. So we've been working with the Wild Neighbors Database Project, who's a member org, to modify this database for oiled wildlife. We've used it in different ways during some of the smaller spills that we've had recently, but this was the first time that we really wanted to try a more full implementation of the database. During the spill, we still utilized a dual documentation system, especially for intake and processing and some of our evidentiary information that we need to collect, which basically required us to kind of have an extra person or an extra 2 people to scribe or to document this information, because we were documenting it both on OWRM and on paper. So what this was really beneficial for was we could data check. So we could basically use the information on paper and use the information that we had within OWRM and make sure that we were effectively capturing the right information. And we're very pleased with the results so far. We still have a lot of work to do, as Kira mentioned, with the recovery app. We're always working to make it more user-friendly. The other huge benefit was that a lot of our responders were actually able to use it this time. It's definitely something hard to implement into our trainings. We're trying to come up with unique ways to do that. But this was an opportunity for our responders to actually utilize OWRM and also give us feedback on how we can make some small changes and implement it even better. I also wanted to touch on media and outreach. As was already mentioned, this spill was highly political and received a high amount of media attention, which always complicates the response. We want to make sure that we're being mindful of the animals that we have in care and our operations are done safely, but also making sure that we are sharing the great work that we're doing with the public. So what we did very quickly is we worked with the Wildlife Branch and the Joint Information Center to dedicate a portion of our website to sharing approved information, such as wildlife numbers, which were updated regularly, approved photos, and also important phone numbers, because this is definitely a place that people will go to look for information. So this was something we were able to implement very quickly. We also worked to coordinate media events through the Wildlife Branch. The benefit of this is to pre-plan tours and media events really allows us to strategically think about how we're going to share the information and the work that we're doing with the public or with the requested tour, while keeping the animals safe and also minimally impacting the operations. So that pre-planning and that coordination was a huge, huge benefit and really allowed us to share the great work that we were doing safely and effectively. Some of our lessons learned, as was already mentioned, early activation is important. Sometimes with care and processing, we will hold off until field operations gets their boots on the ground and kind of reports back and as to what they're seeing out there. But for this incident, we activated care and processing operations very, very quickly. As mentioned, some individuals flew down. What we did was we drove down with some additional equipment. So our team got on the road Saturday morning. And as Dwayne mentioned, it's greater than an 8-hour drive down to Los Angeles. So we worked with International Bird Rescue to help get the facility up and running. We have a cache of supplies down there that they were able to tap into and start to turn the facility over for us. So that collaboration was excellent. Additionally, we activated Point Blue Conservation Science. We wanted to get a team of responders down to assist us with processing. So this early activation was key and very, very beneficial, as the first animal, the ruddy duck, was collected, I think at like 9:30 that morning. Field stabilization is highly, highly beneficial. The work that was done there to stabilize the animals prior to transferring them to primary care was a huge asset. The animals came to us bright and alert. They worked to warm them up while they were there. And the communication and collaboration that happened as to when the animals were going to come was very streamlined and just worked really, really well. We are going to prioritize updating our avian protocols and also increasing our focus on facility readiness. With COVID-19, it has been a little bit challenging to have FaceTime with all of our primary care facilities and their managing network members. So we want to really try to get out there and increase our FaceTime, work on updating equipment and supplies at those facilities. We will continue to regularly evaluate our COVID-19 policies and protocols. I think a new version just came out recently. As the pandemic evolves, we need to continue to evolve how we will respond and how we will make sure that we can keep everybody safe during the pandemic. We will continue to work with implementing OWRM. Again, we were very pleased with this response and how it all came together. And we're slowly going to start to decrease the amount of paper that we're using as we find that this system is working well for us. And finally, we want to work to increase our collaboration with our marine mammal organizations. There was a small marine mammal response, and what we learned is that we just need to increase our collaboration and work together more for that. Before I sign off and give it back to Greg, I just wanted to again thank our amazing network, our affiliated agencies, OSPR, and also our OWCN management team. I mean, we are the Oiled Wildlife Care Network, and without everybody's dedication to the work that we do, we would not have had such a successful response. And the feedback that we were receiving from the wildlife branch was that we really shined, and our work was very much recognized. So thank you very much, and I'm going to turn it back over to Greg.
Thanks, Naeem. Yeah, I will echo that sentiment here in a second. We've got a couple more slides here, and then we'll have a minute or two for questions. Sorry, we packed a lot into this hour. So just a few closing thoughts from the branch director and deputy branch director perspective. The first thing there is just 75% of the time for the branch director and the deputy is responding to others. Unified Command, the EU, media, PIO, liaison, just the liaison work with the elected official and stakeholder calls. We had as many as 100 electeds or 100 stakeholders on each call. Those were at least 2 hours a day. So you've got, and I'll mention this a little bit or I'll note it in the lessons learned, but you've got an awful lot of time where we're not doing wildlife care operations. We're responding and answering questions to the media and to others, but certainly coordination with trustee partners was a big thing. Noah was on site. That was helpful to have them there, and talking with Carol and our other U.S. fish partners. So that was great. Obviously the 209 and reporting daily situations, information, NERDA, so the take home there is you have to be able to block the distractions and not try and get into everything. And at the same time, keep your ears open and know what's happening. It's a key role for the branch director, branch leadership, I should say, to understand what's happening around you so that we can keep the field crew aligned with what's happening from the command side. Lots of forms, as you imagine. And of course, we do spend some time planning for the next operational period, the actual wildlife part. Next slide. So a few lessons learned in a spill this size. A deputy branch director is critical. In my rotation there, I had Dr. Zaccardi, who was spectacular. That was phenomenal. But I also would say, and I know Mike would agree, Larry Henkel, also serving as a branch director and helping us out, was phenomenal. That just the three of us were able to get an awful lot done in an efficient and collaborative way. And that was incredibly valuable to keeping the branch rolling. The hotline, unfortunately, in one of the very first media releases, we want the public to know not to go pick up oiled wildlife, not to try and do it themselves, but call the hotline. So we want that number out, but it was the first and only number that went out. So we had some 300-400 calls unrelated to wildlife in the first 24 hours. So that was a problem. We've since taken that up with our PIO, Public Information Office, to try and make sure that we get a volunteer number, maybe a PIO number, some spill incident things, so that it will be very clear not to use the wildlife hotline, just to say you're interested. As I mentioned, the stakeholder demands, that was a lot. We addressed that partway through and trying to shuffle the leads, and it wasn't just wildlife, it was every functional group of the operation into the very start of those calls, so that then the directors could drop off and go get back to work. The templates that Holly and Laird have put together over the years, incredibly valuable, also on the OWCN side, as to org charts and all that, just to have everything ready. We were so much more efficient in maintaining the ICS documentation and timeliness by having templates. It was tremendous. End of the day, at the end of every day, the wildlife branch, all the group supervisors and directors all talk And this is people working 14-hour days every day. People are overwhelmed. One thing, when you're exhausted, your communication skills may not be at their finest. So talking about maybe a little bit of a script there to make sure we don't miss anything in terms of planning for the next day. Also going to reassess the wildlife app in terms of end user needs. So that's great. The field side that Janine talked about and how our users, or I guess Kira talked about how that goes in the field and how it works for them. But then somebody's going to get maps and be planning on things. So do they need a daily map or a segment map or certain types of maps? So we're going to be looking at some of those things. Next slide. Definitely difficult to get messages to all staff, like including the OSROs, the 204s are supposed to get out to everybody, but we had some indications that they didn't, in terms of, for example, speed limits on beach, nights and that sort of thing. I mentioned this a little bit earlier, alluded to it. You know, you can't do it all yourself. Ask for help, trust the team, trust the people around you that they know what they're doing and they're doing the right thing. It's a key thing. And then just finally, you know, I do believe we provided best achievable care, which is our statutory mandate for wildlife in California. And just second, Janine, and I think the whole team's sentiment that, you know, we've got 40+ member orgs, a state organization, and we're all working seamlessly together. We're sharing funding, training, resources, staffing, passion, excellence. I'm not sure there are a whole lot of examples of that out there in the world. So thank you to everybody that did that and for all your work and your continued work. There's no doubt that we are the world's leading wildlife care response organization collectively. And, you know, we only want to see it grow throughout California so we can continue to expand that everywhere. Obviously, those fixed facilities were really helpful. We were pretty well set in that particular location. Northeastern California, for example, will be a whole different scene, but we will continue building. So thanks to everybody. That's it for me, Janine and Scott.
Okay, thank you all very much for great talks. As you can see, it was very busy activities, and I think people did a great job explaining kind of the activities. I did answer several of the questions, knowing that we only have 2 minutes left. I answered several of the questions by typing in answers. I did leave one that I will ask the team from Richard, who always comes up with great answers. Basically, the gist of the question is, obviously, it was difficult to mobilize personnel during because of COVID restrictions, etc. And the request for member orgs. The question really is, were the procedures that were used during pipeline spill the new normal, or is it more just a COVID blip and going back to standardized practices?
I can hop on this if you want, Mike. So Richard, great question as always. And just from a personnel coordinator side, the answer is no, we're gonna be adapting. So it'll be adapting as the world adapts. So right now we factor in lots of things, county and statewide recommendations that were in place during pipeline. We also needed to factor in and wanted to work with the member organizations involved directly, for instance, like an International Bird Rescue operating out of the San Pedro facility. We wanted to make sure we were in line with their general needs and concerns regarding having personnel on site at that facility. And so we really limited things a little bit more cautiously and proactively during this incident. But I believe, hopefully, if the world continues to head in what we believe is a better direction and less restrictions, then we will be able to slowly open up to a more of our traditional response model, which in this case, to give you an example of what that would have looked like if COVID was not around, is that we would have reached out for additional volunteerism from all local member orgs, including at the primary care facility, and would have had probably some heightened numbers of volunteers. But in this case, we really did intentionally keep those numbers internal to mainly International Bird Rescue volunteers at the facility, for example. So it's very, very limited.
Great, thank you, Scott. We are over time, but I am going to do my directorial oversight and give you one question as well. For those of you who presented today, the Spill Readiness Genie is bestowing upon you one wish. If you had one wish based on lessons learned from pipeline P00547 to change one thing in readiness, what would it be? Let's start with Greg.
That's a good question. I really feel comfortable that we were ready. So that was a terrific thing. I think my view, knowing in hindsight, looking back, that we were not rate or funds limited, it was do whatever needs to be done. I might have scaled up faster with more staff on day one and scaled down. We didn't really limit it a lot, and COVID did have a factor in it, but I might be more aggressive to staff up a few more people, for example, in Recon and maybe in some other places on day one.
Okay, thank you. Kira.
Yeah, I guess I would sort of agree with Greg. I would probably add more recovery teams early on, but as Scott mentioned, we were a little bit limited with COVID situation, and also what I mentioned with just having enough people that were trained up. So yeah, more personnel.
Okay, Dwayne.
I think for field stabilization is familiarity with the brick and mortar facility. So I'd say becoming more familiar with these standalone rehab centers that we might be activated at, just figuring out how we would use them, how we would set up and everything.
And Deneen.
All right, because I don't want to duplicate the amazing ones that everybody has already said, and I agree with them. I would say my thoughts would be those updated avian protocols and some of the quick response guides / species specific guidelines that we're going to come up with. I think that would have been really, really helpful for our team, in addition to everything else that everybody already said.
Okay. Well, thank you all very much for your excellent presentations. Thank you to the more than 60 people that joined us today. I believe Kira put the link in the chat for additional information related to the species and the animal numbers, as far as daily totals, etc. Please go to that link. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to either Scott or Deneen to close us out.
All right, Deneen, I can close this out here. So thank you, everyone. I think that concludes our lecture series for today. And as Greg kindly mentioned, as far as he gave a little shout out, but we have 3 more lecture series coming up, one per month. So April, May, and June. If you need help finding those dates, just email us at owcn@ucdavis.edu, and we're happy to let you know. So thank you very much. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.